when I got notification that there was a slot available, I originally proposed that Professor Anthony Turton actually come and do this presentation. How many people in the audience know Professor Anthony Turton or have attended any of his talks around the country and so on? I see one or two. People from SAPOA, members of SAPOA, the South African Property Owners Association. How many water engineers are here? So, okay, I see there's a correlation there. How many facilities managers are here in terms of existing properties? Okay. So, by rights, what I've gone and done is I've gone and summarized a whole lot of information from Professor Anthony Turton based on the presentations that he does to bodies like SAPOA, South African Managing Agents, SAFMA, South African Facilities Management Association. We've even briefed the SARS people on these issues. And very quickly in the beginning of my presentation, I'm going to run through a whole lot of information that summarizes the current situation in the country. But I can see that, having come lately into the process, that there's a lot of information already addressed by the gentleman before me. Generally, we've seen a collapse of the systems that measure, monitor, and predict water resources. There's an enormous amount of material available, and that Professor Turton uses to say, talking about infrastructure failure in general. We know about that. I'm not going to go into that detail. If anybody wants to try and get some kind of perspective on that and what the implications are, some of it I deal with a little bit later. We mentioned there are transformational imperatives that are undermined. There's a whole lot of transformational objectives from the government, and it's mainly focused on the poor. One can expect that. But the infrastructure failure and their inability to deliver is actually undermining that. We have issues that are coming up now, and this is the socio-political kind of arena, if you want to talk about it. Separated land and water rights. The government owns all the water. In fact, they own the water in your bladder at the moment. And if they don't, they probably soon will. And the other point I'd like to make about, we've been drinking sewage water for years. Even the water that you're drinking in that bottle right at the minute probably went through a dinosaur's kidney about 100 million years ago. Okay? So all of this puts a huge bureaucratic burden on the state, and we can see this is part of the infrastructure and governmental sort of failure in systems and management and so on. SA's waters generally is overstretched. We had some figures here for the Western Cape, but I've just summarized completely. Our national water deficit is projected at over 2 million cubic meters by 2025. Generally, we have a looming water crisis or a slow onset disaster coming for the entire country. The Western Cape, Cape Town in particular, probably looks like one of the more acute situations. We have issues where major bulk water programs are delayed. I don't know if anybody can tell me whether the information I saw was current or correct, but I saw a list on the Department of Water and Sanitation site that showed desalination as a strategy for Cape Town is number 6 on the list and is earmarked for 2025. Is that correct? Okay. South Africa has over 1,000 water treatment plants, and nearly a quarter of these are producing below specification. And the spec itself is in question as well. South Africa has 824 bulk wastewater treatment plants, and they treat 5 billion litres per day. Only 16% of these discharge to specification into the rivers. The rising risk of a multitude of contaminants and toxins in all the sources. You guys have a laboratory, don't you? Okay. Pathogens, some are mutating. There's a lot of work, seminal work done on this around the world. And metals from sewage and acid mine drainage. Eutrophication and the rise in algae blooms. And then, of course, the concomitant sort of result out of all of that is cyanobacteria becoming a major concern. Microcystin, this is a comment from Tony Turton's work. Microcystin is the biggest single risk to the economy with unquantified implications. We'll unpack a little bit of that just now. Salinity. I'll talk to you about how the salinity of the Vaal system is rising rapidly and a major concern, from sewage, tailings, mines, agricultural runoff, and other sources, industrial. The rise of levels of estrogen, antibiotics, and drugs in the water. Who's measuring that? Do we know if it's a problem? A lot of this material is taken from a very detailed work done by Professor Turton for the Institute of Race Relations, where he examined the effect on the water crisis on the poor. And unfortunately, in this whole thing, it is these guys that suffer the most, and more acutely and more directly. From direct contamination, contaminated food, healthcare processes and facilities are compromised because of this, and of course, the rise of water entrepreneurs. Here's information from a company called DHI, the Danish Hydrological Institute, that is contracted into the Department of Water and Sanitation to provide a website called the National Integrated Water Information System. They assimilate an enormous amount of data from the Department of Water and Sanitation, and they present it, process it, and present it in this kind of format. This shows how acute, and specifically on the top right, some of the acute situations that are being experienced in the Western Cape. If you go onto this particular site, like on the left-hand side, you can mouse over some of those things there, and a lot of metadata pops up and gives you information about the current situation. They only process information which comes from Department of Water and Sanitation. Our rainwater gauging stations are dysfunctional, have receded back to 1960 levels. So the amount of information coming in other words, the ability to predict what is happening right now, has been compromised severely. Here's a sewage dilemma. We're sitting on the closed loops in the Olifants River system where sewage is treated to potable, etc. We've got 6 closed loops on that system where water is extracted, provided as potable water, goes into the toilet, showers, and everything finds its way out from the sewage system, and it is released, often under specification, into the same river, and just down the river somebody else is doing exactly the same. Major problems on many of our rivers, and I don't know whether these kind of situations exist in the Western Cape. Here we have a picture of a dysfunctional sewage works creating eutrophic conditions, and there the right-hand side arrow is a rotund. Guys are growing crops, extracting water from the self-same river. Here's a graphic showing the Gauteng supply via Rand Water. Beautiful interbasin transfers and sources and things. You guys are doing the same things into the Vaal Dam, and goes from beautiful water blue right through to red. Why? Because there are 6 points where there are dysfunctional sewage plants allowing under specification sewage to flow into the river. And Rand Water picks up that and cleans it for the whole of Joburg. 60% of the economy is affected here. Rand Water is considering activated carbon at the moment. They're just lifting the levels of chlorine that they put into the water so to try and compensate for the rising levels of bacteria and so on. But what are they doing about all the other issues that I mentioned earlier on? Huge questions. This is not this forum, not the subject of my discussion, but I'll pick that up a little bit later in another format. Right, so generally we deal with a concept called the assurance of supply. This is what municipalities and government are supposed to do. They own all the water. It's a similar logic to the energy. They give you a guarantee of a given volume, of a given quality, at a given price. That's changing quite rapidly. At a given place, to your house or to your complex, and any given moment in time, 24 hours. Okay? So that's the sort of contract with the government or municipalities. Now, what I want in specifically in this thing here is, having sketched the scenario and the risks that are facing us, we believe that the correct response into the future, whether it's a new property development or an existing property development, that may or may not be considering extensions as well, but you're under operational conditions as opposed to developmental conditions, that you should consider business, water as a business risk in general. Okay? So we preach a lot, and especially to the residential communities, where corporate governance is not at the highest standards. Water as a business risk needs to be addressed in the boardrooms of South Africa urgently. Just like any other risk, companies have very good governance systems. But because they've been spoiled with water, it's something municipality supplies. If it gets cut, they must supply. And we pay them rates, so why don't they fix the damn thing and do it? We believe that the response should be different. This should be evaluated very carefully. And like electricity, we've been spoiled, and Professor Turton continuously gives out a message saying this is business unusual. With infrastructure failure upstream, the problems are coming downstream to communities. Communities being gated communities, communities being commercial, communities being mixed, much like this particular complex here. Okay? That's just a comment. This is the kind of attitude that we find much more in the residential community side of things. And that's to a large extent the way they are structured and how the water gets to every single house. We believe the proper governance processes and water risk assessments need to be done. One needs an integrated water and environmental thinking. The gap between operational personnel and directors needs to close. I have so many situations where when we talk about having to deal with water as a risk, I get referred to the facilities manager or the sustainability manager or the environmental manager, as opposed to somebody on the board that is dealing with sustainability, resilience, environmental, or whatever. And these poor guys all complain to me saying that they hand the problem to us and say we've got a water problem, sort it out, but there's no budget. And then they go through a long, complicated process to try and convince and present to the board that we've got big problems coming if we don't do something about it and everything. And then you've got to go through whole budget cycles and get decisions made and budgets allocated to go into the future. There's a dislocation between the responsibility and the key strategic thinking which is required. Okay? Now, just generally speaking, a note, and I think it was touched on by the presentation on future thinking. The United Nations, and in more particularly the Food and Agricultural Organization, and Professor Turton is doing a lot of work with them, is tending to take a stance, let nature do more of the work. A lot of the processes and systems that we have in place have largely been chemicals based, correct? Okay, mechanical and chemical. But there's a huge move to allow nature to do a lot more of the work, integrate the environmental issues together with the water issues, and come up with solutions. And I love some of the stuff that has been presented here. So a lot of those concepts can actually be applied, retrofitted to existing operational property complexes. So in other words, proper long-term mitigation strategies are needed for business resilience. Budgets need to be allocated. And it's tough under the current economic situation. But as we've seen from some of the presentations already, if one looks at this as an opportunity to lower your carbon footprint, lower your cost of water from the municipality, and take all of those things into account in an integrated fashion, you might find that there's actually a return on investment or a much lowered cost of doing nothing, if you want to term it that. And of course, this needs to be regularly adjusted and reviewed into the future. Okay, just here, there's a couple of things coming from work that Danish Hydrological Institute, DHI, has done. On the left just shows some of the reporting information, and a lot of people are not responding in terms of some of the processes that they go through. And on the right-hand side, more importantly, the water-related impacts are resulting in financial impacts for companies. Financial impacts reported by 10 companies in 2015 amounted to 841 million. Drought and increased water stress, 610 million. Just 10 companies. Pretty big ones, but still. Ecosystem vulnerability. And of course flooding, 35 million. This is serious stuff. So one approach to consider, this is central to ours. First of all, to make a point, no two business settings are the same. Century City here is not the same as Waterfall City, who we're doing a bit of work with, by the way, on this front. water and environmental, we do a water and environmental. Now, I put that environmental in brackets because more and more letting nature do more of the work and thinking of water and environmental in an integrated fashion is becoming the norm. It should be becoming the norm. We tend to go through processes where we describe the risks, we have a classification of the risks into operational, regulatory, health and safety, etc., 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 and we look at the nature of the hazard, we look at the likelihood of it occurring, the severity and the frequency. And anybody that does proper risk processes within their corporates will see that that's very close correlation to normal King, Sorbon's, Oxley, whatever governance processes that you adopt within your company. In this particular case, we use Professor Turton's methodology, the octagon of risk. We then go into an integrated water and environmental management plan underpinned by a coherent corporate strategy. This cannot live in isolation from all of your other strategic objectives at corporate level. This will give you a 20-year budget cycle of confidence and create a robust or resilient mitigation strategy into the future. An IWMP is the business's strategic response to the identified risks. It should address the food, energy, water nexus where appropriate. The standards should be standards compliance, whether you adopt the Alliance for Water Stewardship or use EcoCert. I know there's a lot of work that Tony does with the Green Building Society, and I believe there's a number of initiatives as well. What is the Greener Cape? Is another initiative. Are you tapped into that as part of you guys? And there are objectives and international standards and frameworks, which I think you work according to, and so on. A key element in the strategy is building the concept of an uninterrupted water supply. It's not a new issue. We see an uninterrupted power supply from the energy side, uninterrupted water supply. And there are ways of putting this kind of concept together so that you are resilient under just about any circumstance. Okay, the quality of the water should also be uninterrupted. How many people know on a daily basis what the quality of the water coming in through the municipal system is? Okay, we can talk about that. The water should be fit for purpose, of course, we know that. Irrigation, ablutions, potable, or whatever it is. And an integrated water and energy management plan takes all of those assurance of supply elements into account. So that's just one approach. That's Guru Manzi's approach, largely based on the lifetime work of Professor Anthony Turton. So the uninterrupted water supply concept brings a defined level of assurance of supply and therefore reduces all the 5 elements of that risk. I'll give you an example. We have an estate where the ring main in the estate is owned by the municipality, and the fire hydrants come off that ring main, and it is fed from one main supply and a reservoir in the region. I'm not going to mention who it is. If there's a cut in that supply, the fire hydrants can't work. Who knows about the Braamfontein fire? It's in the news. And apparently they could not put that fire out because the pressure had reduced on the fire hydrants. It is a huge risk. There's an opportunity to deploy new technology. Move away from chemical-based technology. There's technology coming for the real-time detection of bacterial and biological contamination. I'm sure some of the gentlemen here can probably give a lot of information around that. There's huge developments in advanced oxidation using magnetic, electric, and in some cases, I believe from Korea, some nanobubble technology as well that changes the state of water. So you don't use chemicals to oxidize, like chlorine, to oxidize contaminants in water. There's improving UV technology coming through from NASA, I believe, and it's starting to find its way into South Africa. The rise of leak detection technologies. Who does leak detection on their? You guys do. Okay, leak detection, and they are smart meters at the same time, give you real-time information of water usage. A lot of property people are putting leak detection systems also as a check meter on the inside of their properties to correlate with what the municipal's meter is telling them is coming into their property. So one of our contentions here is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I think that is a generally accepted thing. So here are some of them. The recommendations to people like the Association of Residential Communities, South African Property Owners Association, other industry bodies: don't panic. A risk is only dangerous as long as it is ignored or denied. Be proactive. The water crisis is upon us, irrespective of rhetoric to the contrary. Integrated water management plans underpinned by a carefully thought out risk mitigation is good practice. Water is good governance imperative. Consider an industry approach to your mitigation as well through some of these bodies. Training, legal action, maybe outer, should be repurposed to help industries like SAPOA and ARC to help to mitigate some of the socio-political issues. And of course, the question is, what's the cost of doing nothing? Anybody know what happened in Diepsloot? I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. Construction in the area, digging a big trench. They broke through a water pipe and they broke through a sewage pipe at the same time. The whole thing filled up. The backward pressure into Diepsloot sucked a lot of that sewage into that pipe. People started getting sick, and people were trekking 7 kilometers with things on their head, buckets and goodness knows what. And of course, the rise of water entrepreneurs who rushed into the area and said, we can supply water. They went and fetched it in their bakkies from nearby and came and sold it at an exorbitant price into Diepsloot. And think it took 7 or 14 days before those pipes were clear and they could actually use the water again, and so on. These are serious things. Huge complexes like Waterfall City, Four Ways area, the residential communities in that area, and I imagine it's fairly similar here depending on where your poor communities are located, derive all of their labor, a lot of their labor from these informal communities. Work in your house, work in facilities, and so on and so forth. Here's another one. These socio-political issues need to be unpacked and understood, and the response needs to be correct, I believe, going into the future. We saw the ANC capture state taps in Water for Votes move. There's a lot of this going on, and a lot of opportunity for political opportunists to really exploit this kind of thing. So, the good news. Essentially, a change in mindset regarding water is needed. It's not business as usual. Upstream, there's infrastructure failure. It is not likely to change fast. The responsibility is coming downstream, and you need to do something about it. There's a lot of technological advancement. There's more investment going into water than just about anything else around the world. There are opportunities arising out of it. Some of them have already been mentioned. You can recover clean water from almost any source. You can see the initiatives of Singapore, Australia, even Durban is recovering water and giving it to some of the industries. And I believe Cape Town is doing some of those things. I'm not too au fait with exactly what they are doing already. You can recover minerals. There's new technology coming through where you can recover the phosphates and nitrates from the waste. Acid drain minage sources need to be mined for reuse. There's a lot of stuff that can be done there. Policy reform is needed, but who believes that it's going to happen quickly, fast enough? Okay? So it looks like you're going to have to do your own thing and do it properly to be able to protect yourselves. And of course, credible visionary leadership is needed. Thanks very much.